Welcome everyone to our AAUW virtual program. What can we learn from Jane Addams? First, we'd like to thank AAUW Illinois for sponsoring us and enabling us to deliver these webinars. We invite you to consider joining the AAUW Jane Addams branch. If you are already a member, you can become a dual member of our branch. Please put a note in the chat if you're interested in membership information. We also want you to use the chat tonight to let us know how you heard about the webinar or what organization you are part of. We did some extra promotions, so we'd like you to put your name and what organization told you about our program this evening. We also use the chat window for any questions for the speaker or any technical problems you might have. We ask that you remember to stay muted during the program. We are recording the program and we post the recording on the Jane Addams website. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Gloria McMillan. She began her studies with a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature and went on to get a Master's of Arts in English Literature and Comparative Literature. She also completed a PhD in Rhetoric, Composition, and the Teaching of English. Her dissertation was From Spoken Of to Speakers, Chicago Immigrant Women Writers from 1890 to 1940. She currently is a research associate in the Department of English at the University of Arizona. And she recently edited this work, The Rutledge Companion to Literature and Class. It's our pleasure to have Gloria with us this evening, and I'm going to turn the program over to Gloria right now. Take it away, Gloria.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Elaine, and I want to thank all of you for being here and for inviting me to come and speak. I'm not sure when I should actually put my screen up, so I may wait until I get through talking here. I don't have too many other introductory remarks except to let you know I'm in Tucson, Arizona at the moment, and that's where this program is coming from. So I will put up my first slide now, if I can do that. And it may take a second for everyone to see.
We're good to go.
You're good to go? Okay. Once again, thank you. And the topic today that I'd like to speak to you about is something that I've worked on for 40 years. I've been studying Jane Addams and wondering what we can learn from her. So I want to open with a question that I am sure perplexed her throughout her life. As long as I can get to the next slide, that is. She was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the problem I think that obsessed her is how can we say who we are without saying who we are not and what is wrong with them? Think about that in your life, in your town, country, and in the world. I'm dwelling on it a bit because this is one of the themes, and it has to do with speaking, rhetoric, and asserting who we are. First of all, let's start where Jane started. She started in Cedarville, Illinois, which Elaine Fisher is familiar with, in a very stately home, and she moved to a very low-income part of Chicago in the near south side, near the stockyards and near industry, to found Hull House. And that is her settlement house there pictured in 1889. in a very decrepit mansion that used to belong to Charles Hull, who was one of the wealthy men in the earlier part of the Chicago history. So Jane encountered many different people in Hull House, in this decrepit mansion that she decided to move into in order to do her work. She wanted to work with people who were different than she was, not just people who resembled her. So we tend to refer to them today as the others. And what did she learn from these others, and who were they? Here we have a political cartoon from the mid to late, probably late 19th century, showing immigrants as rats coming into this country, but they're not the usual ones that we have nowadays. They're from Europe. And it says up there on the upper right that this is Europe emptying its sewers daily into the United States. So this was part of the press external image of the lower income inner city of Chicago in the 1890s. This is or late 1880s, 1890s that Jane Addams moved into. You can see the various attributes. They're all criminals. They're all mafia. They have bandit masks and they have revolvers. They're socialist, which to them, the readers, was a bad thing. Anyway, you can see a number of, they're all men too. I'm looking at this more carefully than I did in the beginning. They're all men. Evidently, little children and women aren't coming. It's only men. Oops. Let's see, now I have to go back up, page up. Here we have Jane Addams on the left. We have photos here of Jane Addams on the left-hand side and Josefa Humpel-Zeman on the right. So again, you see the mansion and the elderly picture of Jane down below. She started working with people in the neighborhood by entertaining them, having salons in the afternoon, and she soon learned what women had art talents, cooking talents, various kinds of talents. And one of these was a very young woman named Josefa Humpel-Zeman. And one of Jane's earliest projects was to make their voices heard. People were used to hearing Carnegie's and George Pullman and people who had the money, Marshall Field and Potter Palmer, all saying whatever they thought about the city. But she wanted to be very quiet, listen to these immigrants and these poor people and hear what they thought about their own neighborhood and how they wanted to fit into the city of Chicago. So this was one of her first projects, was to write Hull House maps and papers where her volunteers who came from the more wealthy suburbs went down and mapped. But I'll get to that later. I want to say more about Jane. As a young woman, she could afford to go to Rockford College, which was then Rockford Female Seminary. Her father was a very well-off man in Cedarville. And he even, I think he had died by then, but it came from her inheritance. She got to take a whole year in Europe. And instead of going to the churches, the cathedrals and the palaces, she did some of that, but she went to the poorest parts of these cities. She wanted the complete view of Berlin, of Paris, of London, and Rome. So she saw women who were in terrible conditions. Girls in the Munich beer gardens had big steam burns on their arms. She wrote about that in Hull House maps and papers, or in 20 years at Hull House, I forget. And in London, she saw children and grown people on the East End of London fighting and struggling to get half-rotten cabbages on a street market auction. And she saw that those children were very malnourished. So she looked around, especially in London, and she found this building, which I'll talk about later, Toynbee Hall, and the work that was going on there. But for now, let's just concentrate. This is Jane Addams, and this is one of her first proteges, a woman named Josefa Humpel-Zeman, who wrote a chapter in Hull House maps and papers. Oops, I keep going too far. Let's see, how do I go back up? I go back up. My trigger finger is too fast, I guess. Well, Jane Addams had a relationship with other women of her own class who were from the north side of Chicago, like Frances Willard, who was very prominent in temperance, unionism, and especially women's suffrage, getting the vote. So one thing that she differed with Frances Willard, and later I understand as I read more about her prep for this talk, Frances Willard did come around and she started supporting African Americans, but she was very late in doing that because her big goal was to get the most votes of all women. And so she did not want to offend the ex-Confederate women, the progressives in the South, who didn't want any of this about lynching. So Jane Addams at first shared the view that probably these men who were being lynched in the South were guilty. And she was reading the same stories that everyone else in Chicago was reading, and that these people had to be kept in place because they were getting out of hand and all this, and they were probably guilty. So, but Jane Addams said, even when she hadn't questioned the coverage, she said, even so, they should have a fair trial. They shouldn't just be strung up on trees. But then she met on the left-hand side, Ida B. Wells. And I'll go into my next slide about that. Here's a younger version of Ida B. Wells. She was a freed slave journalist who had owned and operated the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. And a lot of her campaigning was against lynching. I'll show you a book that she wrote, a biography, actually her granddaughter wrote. And her business there in Memphis was wrecked by a mob. So at that point, knowing when it was good to get out, she moved up to Chicago and started again working on different newspapers probably as a freelancer. And she met Jane Addams at Hull House. In fact, I know that she was invited there with the early prototype of the NAACP officers when they were just forming. She was invited to Hull House. So this is all recorded on one website, which I'll show you on the next page down. That is this. Stacy Lynn McDermott over at Ramapo College in New Jersey has assembled a really nice, as part of the Jane Addams papers, a very nice site about Jane Addams, her relationship with Ida B. Wells. I think there are other illustrations in it and racial injustice in America. I do give that both on the previous page and at the end of my talk. There's another reference to that link that you can go to. So there were a lot of contacts that Jane Addams had with Ida B. Wells. They met at various events, and she did become, Jane did become an active supporter of both the NAACP and Ida's campaign against lynching. And this was quite early for a prominent American, perhaps the loudest, or not loudest, but the most quoted American woman, or perhaps most important voice in public, was Jane Addams at this point in time. So as I said, Addams concluded that the stereotypes of African Americans caused what I'm terming, it's my own term, I'll admit it, a media avoidance zone. And that is where the only information that comes about a place is outside information. And you never get reporting from, in this case, African Americans. You get reporting about them, but not coming from them. And that's an important distinction. I'll be going over that again. Here's Toynbee Hall that I mentioned earlier. Jane Addams really was impressed by what they were doing in London. And I'll just say a word, I don't have time, but it's worth looking him up. Arnold Toynbee, who was a very evolved, progressive thinker who only lived to the age of 30, and that's whom this building is named after. He believed that the gulf between the rich and the poor could be handled in the cities, which were mushrooming at that time. So graduate students from Oxford and Cambridge and other schools went and lived at Toynbee Hall. Often they were working somewhere else. And this was what Jane Addams saw, and it sparked her imagination. Here again is a William Booth map of Toynbee Hall. William Booth was the head of the Salvation Army in London, and he worked closely with a man named William T. Stead, S-T-E-A-D. And Stead came to Chicago in 1893 to report on the World's Fair. He was running the Pall Mall Gazette. He was a very fiery reformer with strong nonconformist, as they call it in England, views. And so he wrote a book called If Christ Came to Chicago, about Chicago. It was very fiery, and what made him different was that he actually listed the addresses of the very wealthy people in the first pews of the Episcopal Church who owned the brothels, and he made a an appendix of that. So they almost wanted to run him out of town. It's an interesting story. You can look him up. I didn't have time to go into that here. This is I don't want to run out of time, but he's a very, very interesting, influential, and all historians of American history, and especially Chicago history, should know that book, If Christ Came to Chicago. All right, so people were going from being spoken of in media avoidance zones to being speakers. There were many refugees and very poor immigrants who were living in the Hull House area. And Jane Addams took it very slowly by just entertaining these women at afternoon teas and asking them, you know, well, as we're talking here, what do you think should be done about this neighborhood? What do you need? What would your children like to see here? So she would write on this, and that wasn't very unusual. She would get, anytime she wanted, she had connections with the wealthier part of town, she could get an article or a column into a newspaper. But because she was living there among these people, she wanted to see them get published, and that was never done. So one of the first people that she connected with was the one I already mentioned, Josepha Humpel-Zeeman, who wrote a chapter in Hull House Maps and Papers. And she was only 23 or so, 25 when she was writing these things. And here you see chapter 4, where she's describing the neighborhood of Hull House and how it used to be the Prague center of all the Czech or Bohemian people. She was the editor of Ženské listy, that means the women's pages, a fiery feminist journal in Chicago written in Czech. I took 2 years on my dissertation running between Chicago and Tucson at the Bohemian Heritage Museum. I know a little Czech, not well, and I worked with a woman named Jitka Vesel, who's a native speaker. So I would do my rough translations and she would go over them. And so this was incorporated into my dissertation. None of this has ever been translated before. So you see her various essays and what she had to say about life in Chicago as a foreign-speaking Czech. But she also wrote in English, and she also published novels in the United States in English to make money. She first met Jane Addams probably in this order. She was 23 years old, and she was at the World's Fair in 1893 collecting 6,000 signatures. I don't know if that's a day, but maybe the total was. She was very well educated for an immigrant woman and able to speak several languages. She acted as a secretary to Bertha Palmer of the Palmer House, and that in the women's building. And I'm sure Jane Addams visited that building quite often or even went to their board meetings. Josepha probably met Jane Addams at this time. Here's a cover page, which isn't very well resolved. It's a little blurry, but this is one of her cover pages of her feminist journal. And you can see that it has a beautiful feminist thing at the top, flowers. And she was always writing her fiery editorials. Some of the immigrant women wouldn't talk directly about social issues, but Josepha would just let it go and say what she thought about women's right to education and the right to vote, suffrage, ownership of property, and especially how men should behave to their wives and to women in general. However, because she was so outspoken, although I'm sure Jane Addams thought nothing was wrong with that, Josepha ran into trouble with the Bohemian men in the Czech community of Chicago because she started an all-women print shop. And she had had print shop training, printers training. So all the reporters, every job in the shop was done by a woman. Even the printer's devil was a little girl and not a boy. And they were starting to do really well, and they were getting the weddings and the big community celebration, all the flyers and calendars. And the men noticed that their business was going away. So they started a campaign against Josepha, poor Josepha, with character assassination because of the way her shop was taking business. She had a very pathetic farewell editorial where she said that. She said they were saying bad things about her which weren't true, and that she was sad to have to leave. So she handed, in order to silence the men, she handed the journal over to another woman to run, and she went back to Prague, thinking she'd only stay a while. And she toured Bohemia as a speaker on women's rights. However, she had a cerebral hemorrhage and died at the age of 36. And here we see the Art Nouveau, the monument that they put up in Prague. I assume the women's societies in Prague. They had a male sculptor make it, and it's in the Art Nouveau style, called The Soul Escapes. It's in the Olshansky Cemetery in Prague. Another woman who knew Jane Addams was Hilda Sack-Polacek's. Her family had immigrated from Poland. She actually, in her later years, put together this memoir called I Came a Stranger, The Story of a Hull House Girl by Hilda Sack-Polacek. And again, it was a big heroic struggle of adaptation and overcoming many obstacles. But in her memoir, she never forgot the acceptance that she felt at Hull House and how that sort of formed her and also changed her life. I believe she does talk about Jane Addams herself. I don't know how well I don't remember the memoir that well at this point to remember if she knew her personally. So now moving on to the other aspect of Hull House at this period was that they were a founder of sociology in this period. And again, it's a very contested origin in the United States, who founded sociology and what credit should be given, especially by the men who were later at the University of Chicago and Northwestern, who they created a term called sociologists, and they would only award that to people that had a terminal degree. So the women at Hull House that did the work I'm going to show you were prior to this period, and they didn't have that degree. So then they later became relegated to and known as social workers. But this is the actual formation of sociology in this country. And that's why Hull House maps and papers were such a landmark. So here we see the ethnic map. I don't remember how many maps there are. There are a number of maps. And one of these is just the ethnic distribution. So the Hull House workers would go from house to house. And you can see up in the top, it's the Italian group circled in white. In the middle, we don't have the Jewish ghetto, and it's out of this picture. It's off the range of this picture. At the bottom, circled in yellow, we have the ones that Josefa Humpel-Zeman was writing about in yellow. If you look up at the top, the Italians, you see how many are blue. And that has to, I mean, that's the Italians. And the reason they seem to all be on the front on the street is that many of them probably had restaurants and food industry businesses on their blocks. Whereas down here, the Bohemians don't have as many. They're in yellow. They're not on the street. A lot of their dwellings are inside. You see that they don't front on the street. So various things. All of these maps tell a story. The next person that Jane Addams worked with was Charles Zublin. And he was from a rather, not well off, but a more established family in this country. I think he himself was an American, but his parents were probably immigrants. He became the first professor of sociology at Northwestern University, and he wrote on the Jewish community in Hull House maps and papers, which was more on Maxwell Street. He founded the Northwestern University Settlement House. So he said that opportunity was all any immigrant needed, and they run with it. And here's the first page of his chapter in Hull House maps and papers, which they had these essays that went along with the maps. It's quite interesting. And I thought that the Congregation of Men of Obscurity, that's really true. You know, in 1848 in Chicago, you'd have to be the Men of Obscurity. So if you have a chance, you can probably read it online from your library. You can read these. So, and there's also an online source. If you Google these names, you can find them online. The Hull House physician, a woman doctor named Alice Hamilton, caught the essence of social opportunity. And she actually made the case that it isn't so bad to have this kind of corruption that cities tend to have. And even when you have political equality, it means little if you're being called these names all these times. The social ostracism, she says, was what was hard to take. And she was right there. So she's a firsthand observer of it. She said, when you're being called these names, Dago, Polak, Hunky, Greaser. Well, Negro is probably not exactly what they were saying, but it's harder to bear than the political corruption. And that was her observation, and there's a link to it. The next map will show the income in that same area. It's interesting. I was looking at this one block down here, and this is I'm having trouble because my controls cover up some of these legends at the bottom, but black I know is the lowest income level, and you see how they're all concentrated down here at the lower right. If you go to I saw that there's more on these two streets that are in the highest income level. That's the yellow. So they tend to cluster together. These are probably the more well-kept and higher maintained apartment houses, or maybe even some of them are single family dwellings. As you look at this map, you can see that incomes tend to cluster. So the people who are in the second to the lowest or the lowest often live on the air chute. They're not anywhere near the front of the building. They're way in the center, not enough air. Now I'm moving to the third and final that we have in Hull House Maps and Papers. The new voices that are coming in was by Alessandro Mastro Valerio. He later became quite a successful fine artist, and there's actually a couple of his paintings at the Smithsonian Institution. So he was a more educated person, and he does not want the Americans, and especially the people in Chicago, to get the wrong idea about the Italians. They do not come to America to find a home, he says, as do the British, the Teuton Slavs, and Scandinavians. But he views it as a trip Italians make to make more money and then go back to the home that they really love, which is Italy. And so this is an earlier view before any of the gangster and mafia type smear had been attached to the Italian community in Chicago. He has a much more well-rounded picture that he gives. And that's another sign: when you lose your own narrative, it becomes skewed. Only the worst examples of your group people will hear about. They won't hear about the whole picture. So from Alessandro Mastro Valerio, you get the whole picture because he's talking about his own colony there in Chicago. And again, you can find his chapter online, or you can get the book either in electronic Hull House Maps and Papers, either electronically or in print. So the Italians in particular in Chicago, as you know, became a media avoidance zone, my term, meaning they were only written about and nobody was listening to what they said about their group as much. So when you compare Mastro Valerio's account of the Colonia with later writing in the Tribune and places, the worst examples come to the fore. And that's what happens when people cannot tell their own story. And I will show you some of these worst examples. Here is representing the urban problem. And we have a line drawing from probably the 1890s, early 20th century, showing Chicago as Dante's Inferno. And he says up here, although it's blurred, I wish I could have seen this before I wrote my book. In other words, this is some of the rings of hell going into Chicago, and there's a skeleton hand beckoning him to come in. So this would reinforce people's feelings about what Chicago was and who lived there. And again, I saw Chicago was a media avoidance zone, and outsiders could reinforce their views of themselves by turning the South Side into a dangerous other, ignoring these people until making them invisible until they were hypervisible when something bad happened, like a shooting, one of these gang shootings. So losing their own narrative. By 1930, there were tourist maps for well-off people to visit Capone Land. It's sort of like a Disneyland of vice. You can go see Capone Land, and we have a map of that too. You can enlarge this if you ask to get this, or I think you could actually find it elsewhere online, but you can click to do, zooming in on these parts. And right where Hull House is, let me see, I think it's right in here near the stockyards, wherever that stockyards. It's in this area somewhere. With all the shooting, these little bangs are the shots going off. Here's Hull House, right, right in this. And Jane Addams was still alive in 1930, so she would have been enjoying all this. I like the fish drinking out of the beer mug here. And there's all kinds of humor in this when you blow it up so that you can actually see these things. But one of the big mistakes in this, aside from only coming up with the most negative examples of Chicago's Italian community, is that it locates it all in the South Side, which is very self-serving for the North Side. But since my mother lived on the North Side in the 30s when she was very young, I know that this is a misrepresentation because the North Side had Bugs Moran, and he was the North Side mob. So I gave a little helpful link here for even in Wisconsin, they had mob affiliated things to do. So Wisconsin nowadays has a gangster tour, but back then people were much more scandalized, and they tried to keep it all limited to Capone land here. Oh, and here's the old World's, oh, this is the 1933 World's Fairgrounds. So I guess it was part of Capone land too. Now here's a more recent study of urban rhetoric, how people treat the urban life, the life in cities. And this just studies the rhetoric that has become worse and worse. We know that these things really happen, and it isn't that it's all made up. That's understandable and understood. But the way that it's become a crisis, moral hysteria. Steve, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, Masek or Masek, wrote this for the University of Minnesota Press in 2006. It's a rhetorical study of a media avoidance zone where people don't have control of their own narrative, and they're spoken of, but they aren't heard. It's called Urban Nightmares. Back to the old maps, the liberal reformist maps only usually concentrated on vice. So if you could read this, it's very small, but over, I can't find the cursor anymore, but I guess it doesn't matter. Oh, here it is. These are all bars. Then we have cribs. Those are very cheap brothels, and other brothels that are probably casinos. And Colosimo, there's Big Jim. So this is at least probably the 20s. So they're all considered as sapping the city's productivity and public decency. And this establishes the media avoidance zone. And the levy was really, oh, here it is, 1910. It was operational way back, right after the Chicago fire of 1870. It was already going in the late 1870s, called the levy in those days. Hull House's mapping was not to label people and their professions this way as the products of their own vices, but they tried to capture the demographic categories that were explaining these causes for disease, such as pollution, which we know more about now, crime, vice, domestic violence. Some of these things were tied to wages and sporadic employment, ethnic segregation, or even family size. It counters the MAZ by not framing the problems as individuals' moral choices so much as just the conditions of living in this wage scale, polluted, toxic environment, and very few social services. Even groceries were not available. They couldn't have adequate supply of groceries. Oops, I need to go back up here. There. So I made a little cartoon about media avoidance zones where the suburbs are the affluent cheesy bits, but the holes are the media avoidance zones. They have no cultural visibility. They are talked about, but they're not heard. And pretty much that's the cheese. Jane Addams, who lived in the media avoidance zone for 40 years, she heard that these women were saying there are carcasses of horses, piles of manure from the horses, and flies and mice and rats, other things. And it's all because our garbage is not ever picked up. So she discovered that it was a plum, it was a political job. And she thought, well, it is up for vote and it's always just one candidate. I will run to become the garbage inspector, sanitation inspector. So she did. And she won. And for a while, she was going around and making her rounds, and they actually got better trash being disposed of, because that was a huge problem in the early 20th century. Tons of horse manure, which needed to be swept and shoveled. So finally, the politicians, though, found out that she was doing well, and they didn't particularly like that. So they tried, I think what you call it is a form of gerrymandering. They got it to be not a real position, or they divided that position into a couple other positions. And I think she was eased out eventually, but she did show that it could be changed. People could run for these positions and win. So now if we fast forward to today, what would she be doing today? Would she be able to help on these stereotypes? Well, I have some examples from Northwest Indiana because I have some art friends there. And Thomas Frank is someone who came from somewhere else and moved into East Chicago, and he's an artist activist. He has what he's running, it's called a toxic tour of East Chicago. He has a website for that. There are also people working very hard with public art down in the lower picture, murals especially, and activism, and they do street theater that condemns these oppressions and erasures, and it undoes some of the negative stereotype. It really works to undercut the perceived differences from suburban people who are kind of the norm default, and then these are all exotic or pathologized lives, and they're trying to say we all have lives that are everyday. They're not just exotic and pathologized lives. Here's some people at Indiana University Northwest Campus in Glen Park, which is just the south end of Gary. And they do social practice. There's people that are, you can see this is a recent one because they're wearing masks. They're holding these on parking lots, and they come and do theater and various conceptual art. I'm not sure what's going on there, but it looks like it might be some sort of a game where you turn over cards. They're trying to get new ideas to create their own image, and they're taking this show on the road to other parts of Indiana that have not always been that sympathetic or supportive of the industrial Northwest part of the state. Oops, back again. So that what they're doing is reclaiming their local power through the arts, and they're producing a database, and many participation levels of artists are being involved. So it's a very active community there, although not much gets reported on it in the Chicago press. Here's the other aspect of life in a media avoidance zone. Here's Jane Addams' own classes in cooking healthy food. They had truck gardens in those days, and carts would come into Hull House, and they would bring fresh produce. She was teaching young girls, you can see they're pretty young, to cook, even though she wasn't denigrating their ethnic heritage and that they could cook already, but giving them access to vegetables that they didn't have and were very hard to get. So if we look at today's comparison, we still have these same concentrations of food deserts, what we call them in today's society as a food desert. The single mother is the left map, and the percentage of single mothers is overlaid on the food deserts, which are the brown, I think. The food desert is the red outline, and the single mothers are the brown. On the right side, you have the body mass index. So the thinner people are up here, and the heavier people with the high body mass are down here in Chicago, which also has a tie to, oops, once again, back up, the ethnic distribution. This is the food desert. Up here, you have access to closer stores. Down here, the farthest distance, which tends to overlap with African-American populations. And you can see that it doesn't just end at the border of Illinois. Here's Calumet City and something, I can't read that other one, but this is the state line. But as you go, it's all connected. You go to East Chicago, the whole town is a food desert. Gary, the whole town is a food desert. And what this does to developing children is that they're forced to eat, well, they're not forced, but they don't have much other available, the processed food and junk food, because that's what you can get at Circle K's and that kind of a store. So the diet is very inadequate. We know that these media avoidance zones that Jane Addams found in 1890 Chicago are the invisible holes because they're not reported on adequately. They're not covered in any well-rounded way. They're a hole, and she would have said exactly the words I'm telling you, a hole in the social fabric that will haunt us, that will come back to us in many ways. So by getting to know women from the media avoidance zones, and they're also culture avoidance zones, although I have to say the Chicago Humanities Festival is doing a good job with bringing culture, trying to broaden out to all parts of Chicago. All women can benefit from bringing these different culture zones, the ones with adequate representation in the media and the ones who do not have it, bringing them together, because when you see these little children out on the street, it's a waste to lose the brain mass of so many growing children who could grow up to be someone who could help solve these problems that are so pressing, all about environmentalism, war and peace, various kinds of problems that affect us all. So if you're interested, I have a novel that I wrote about 1893 Chicago, and everything but the last chapter is online. It features Jane Addams in a couple of the chapters. Here's a little selected list of books that I used for putting this talk together. And I hope that, Louise Knight, I think, was thinking of coming. I hope she did. I want to thank you, my audience and hosts, for having me. And there's going to be another talk that I'll be giving on Saturday, April 23rd at the Now chapter of Phoenix. It's about the women who had an international conference for peace during World War I, and they were led by Jane Addams, and they braved the submarines to get across the ocean. So if you're interested in that one, just copy my email down, and I can tell you I don't have all the information at the time. Or maybe I do. I think it's at 2 p.m., but I can give you the registration information. So thank you once again. Thank you, hosts. And I guess I'll open it up now for questions. Is that it? Is that how we? Okay, thank you.
Elaine, are you speaking? We can't hear you. Elaine, you are muted.
Gee. You'd think this was the first webinar. Anyway, sorry about that. I'm looking in the chat and I hope people are typing in their questions. I didn't see any initially, but one question that came to mind, I believe I read that Jane Addams had some health issues, and I'm amazed that she was able to continue this work and live a simple life, perhaps without very many privileges during her lifetime, and inspire so many people to work on various projects with her. Do you have any more background on that?
Well, I know in those days, they didn't have the same terminology for osteoporosis and scoliosis, but it was some form of I even heard it was a tuberculosis of her spinal column. I don't know if it was an accurate diagnosis, but it was something like scoliosis, where one shoulder was slightly up, and she did have painful surgeries that may not have been up to the standards that we would do now. And I've read in various biographies that more or less she was in pain a lot of her life. But she never let it get her down, and she did try to downplay whatever her health problems were. So that's basically all I know, but I do give you the links or the citations to several biographies that go into her health if you want more in-depth information about that.
Right, right. Well, it's certainly germane to Women's History Month that we recognize a woman who really created a prototype for sociology. And then, of course, a man professor at Northwestern kind of established the formal program and probably received most of the credit, wouldn't you say?
Teacher, could I get a word in here? I don't want to put it all on poor Charles Zublin. It was also, I think his name was Park. There was another man, and then at University of Chicago, they all got together, the men at Northwestern and University of Chicago, and then even a man named Park who had his own settlement house, I think affiliated with University of Chicago. So it isn't all due to poor Charles Zublin. He was just one of the group there. The boys, one of the boys.
Right, one of the boys.
Yeah.
Did they recognize Jane Addams' inspiration for all of this?
Well, you know how men could talk about women in those days. They would be very flowery and make her Saint Jane and put her on a pedestal. But, you know, it was like, she's outside of our profession, but she's a wonderful woman who's done such philanthropic work, you know. So, but don't call her a professional. You know how they do that. That's rhetoric.
Right. Here's a question. What were the sources for Jane Addams thinking about women and equality? Did she read or hear anything from Marx or Engels, for example?
Oh, she did. She did. And she had socialist speakers and people who would lecture about Marx. She was also as you can imagine, with her ailment, that she spent a lot of her youth reading a lot. So she was very grounded. I'm sure she read Mary Shelley's, Wollstonecraft Shelley's Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she probably read Katie Stanton and all the other women who were suffragettes. And the ones in New England were quite active about these women's rights issues. And she was well connected for someone who didn't have the internet. I mean, Jane Addams was like channeling them some way, you know. She knew everybody.
She was big into networking.
Oh, she was. And that was the whole key to the settlement house movement. They were taking women out of the kitchen, out of the isolated home, and putting them into some kind of a network situation, which was also what Josefa Humpel-Zeman was doing with these Czech women. They used that Ženský listy to be in touch with each other. Some of them lived out in Nebraska on, you know, God's acres out there. Nobody could get to them, but they would get Ženský listy, and then they had all kinds of little chat clubs in the magazine. So this took women out of total isolation. Whereas, you know, from Willa Cather, women used to lose their minds regularly in Nebraska. It was so grim way in the beginning. People would just go mad.
Here's another question. Did Jane Addams overlap with Charlotte Perkins Gilman?
I think they even knew each other. I'd have to go back and check my indices in various biographies. I know she knew of her, but I would be surprised if they hadn't had face-to-face meetings. And the economics of women, I know that was Charlotte Perkins Gilman's main thing, but it was also a big part of Jane Addams. You could see where she was working with these women to get them into jobs and make them able to stand alone without needing the protection of a man. She had the same ideas. She had a girls' dormitory there at Hull House called the Jane Club, which had very inexpensive rooms where young women could board, and because if they didn't have families that would support them or whatever.
I think this is a comment. Jane Addams is one of the founders of WILPF in 1915 to bring about peace during World War I.
That's right. That's part 2 of my talk.
She was one of the founders of that organization,
Right, right. Yeah, that is a very, people forget about, the people in Wilp tend to forget about her city work. I don't mean this to be a criticism, but she had these two very different parts to her. The people in Illinois and Chicago were all about Hull House and everything. The rest of the world are more conscious of Jane Addams, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and Wilp, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which I belong to, by the way. And it's very important globally, but only recently they're starting to try to reconnect the two parts of Jane Addams. It's like she's over here, but she's over here.
This comment, it's my understanding that Hull House has closed. What is going on there now?
I'll repeat the name of the organization one more time because I'm seeing the question down there, and then I'll answer that. If I know the answer. The organization she founded is called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILPF, WILPF for short. And about Hull House, my understanding was, and I don't have it in front of me, that it finally lost its urgency because there now is a field of social work, and there are federal, state, and city programs which did not exist at the time that Hull House was really growing and growing exponentially. So it kept going, and I think they moved it to a near North Side location because the original Hull House no longer was, they tore down some of the buildings, it was just the mansion, and it moved somewhere else. And it was actually doing social work. It was doing welfare work and medical things, but scaling down, and it had to be supported by private donations. And people were seeing, well, we have these programs that are already in laws and things that people can get from the government now. So it dwindled, and I think that's what happened. I think it went on until the 80s, or maybe not 90s, but at least till the 80s, the new location. And that's all I know. You'd have to look to find more details on that.
Well, here's another thoughtful question. What made sociology such a compelling discipline for feminist thinkers?
I think that's very good, that question, because one of the things that Jane Addams did and nobody else managed to do, especially in rhetoric, it's very important. And we know that from all this war and peace going on. Rhetoric is very important. Women had been ascribed and defined as domestic creatures. Their sphere was the home. Their role was to be a mother. And so Jane Addams, very cleverly, I think, with rhetoric, said, well, why can't your family be your community? And think beyond your biological family. Women have a role to keep their house clean, and that house might be your whole neighborhood or your whole city. We are more sensitive to that and sympathetic because we see children suffering from these conditions. They may not be our children, but they are children. And so she broadened that, and she pushed those walls open, that women were no longer just domestic, they were public women who had a civic role in the cities and higher or larger. So that's why sociology comes in, because that is the way that you collect your evidence to back your points you're making about what's happening beyond your own little family. And that was how they began to document in order to make speeches and to get out there and not just be at home.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. You certainly gave us a lot of information. And
don't forget, write to that. You may need my address again, and I guess I could put it in chat.
right, why don't you go ahead and put your email in the chat,
Okay.
and then everyone will.
And then a couple of you said you might want to hear the other talk, and I can give you that complete registration site, give you the link to it.
Right, right.
And I really appreciate having such a very attentive and awake audience. It's actually with the talk. Oh, thank you. Somebody's doing the little. I am just so turned on by Jane Addams and everything that she did that it hurts me when I see that sometimes people see a road and they don't know it. Oh, I know the name, you know, but I think, oh goodness, if she hadn't existed, man. And I think it's very hard for people to know in a different world like ours is, we should have an H.G. Wells time machine to actually go back to see how important she was. And it isn't just, I don't mean great woman, but how beloved. There had never been an upper class woman doing what she did. I can't overemphasize what that means to actually go live there. You know, you can do all the good works you want and you go home, but she went and she lived there. And so when she died, there's a historic photo. You can't walk through the streets. They say it was at least 200,000 people who couldn't get in to the wake or whatever they were holding memorial, but they were all on the streets just to be there while her funeral was going on. And you couldn't walk down those streets. They were crammed in for blocks. And that's how popular she was with the people there in the Hull House. And probably people beyond, you know, people from the whole city of Chicago. I think until Eleanor Roosevelt showed up on the scene, she was of an equivalent status in terms of the global media. They would go to Jane Addams and see what she had to say about these things.
Well, not only did she live there, she ran for the sanitation job, which is not something hardly anybody would do.
That's right. Yeah, she was no wimp. And you see, you see this in her work when she decided to go over to The Hague. I mean, the Atlantic was mined. The submarines, the Germans had blocked it off because they'd been blocked. So to get back, then they blocked it off, and anybody was a fair target. So she went ahead and got on a Dutch ship and went. So often people will say, oh, you know, people don't have the courage to be, you know, in the military, but she was risking her life just as any soldier or sailor would. She was doing it to try to have permanent peace.
The other thing that seems really timely now is she was very open to dialogue and learning from diverse people. And that's certainly something that is needed in current times. It's still relevant.
Well, another thing that connects the two is that she probably would have admitted or said, bragged or whatever, I never would have known what path to take into peace and global peace if I hadn't learned from being around so many people, some of whom were fighting with each other from old grudge wars, you know, different ethnic groups living in the same neighborhood. You can fill in your own ethnic groups, but she saw all that and she knew what might heat it up and make it worse and what wouldn't. But she didn't come up with her peace things from her own brain. It came from those years of living in that area where so many of these different groups were.
She learned from her experience.
That's
She
right.
certainly didn't learn that in Cedarville.
No, I don't think so. But that isn't to minimize the good value she did get from Cedarville, because she was fond of Cedarville. I know that.
Yeah. Well, it's a lovely place, but not very much diversity at that time.
Well, thank you all for your attentive listening. And I see some people I recognize, including my friend Hua Lee, who wrote one of the essays there in the Routledge Companion to Literature in class. She actually came. So I'm happy to see her.
Great. Well, thank you again, Gloria, for this wonderful program. And we thank everyone for coming. And the only other thing that I want to mention, our next program for the Jane Addams branch is going to be a book discussion. On April 27th, we're going to be discussing The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett.